The plate didn't break, but the sound it made when it hit the floor was loud enough to silence half the restaurant. I remember the way every conversation around us paused for just a second, the way a waiter stopped mid-step with a tray in his hand. My daughter-in-law Rachel was still holding her fork when she leaned back in her chair and looked at me like I was something unpleasant she had just discovered at the bottom of her glass. "Which," she said quietly, but not quietly enough. "You should have never come." For a moment, I simply watched the pasta sliding slowly across the polished wood floor beside our table. It was fettuccine with cream sauce, the kind Emma liked, which was the only reason I had ordered it. The smell of garlic and butter still hung in the air. A few people from nearby tables glanced over, then quickly pretended they hadn't heard anything. Restaurants in America have a way of doing that. People notice everything, but they look away to keep the peace. I folded my napkin carefully and placed it beside my water glass. "My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 68 years old, and that night was supposed to be a simple family dinner. Daniel, my son, had called me 2 days earlier and said, 'Mom, we're taking Emma out after her recital. You should come.' His voice had sounded tired but polite, the way it does when he's trying to keep everyone happy. I remember standing in my kitchen in my small brick house outside Columbus, Ohio, the phone pressed to my ear while the kettle hummed on the stove. It had been weeks since I'd seen my granddaughter. Of course I said yes. I even baked a small lemon loaf to bring for Emma, the same recipe she used to ask for when she was younger. The restaurant Rachel chose was one of those modern places downtown where the lights are dim and the menus don't list prices next to half the dishes. When I arrived, they were already seated. Emma waved when she saw me, her small hand lifting above the booth like a flag. Rachel didn't wave. She gave me the same tight smile she always does, the kind that never quite reaches her eyes. "Margaret," she said, as if my name were a formality instead of a greeting. Daniel stood halfway up to hug me, then sat back down quickly, like he didn't want to disturb the balance of the table. I should have noticed the tension then. But when you're a mother, you spend years convincing yourself that small silences don't mean anything. The dinner started normally enough. Emma talked about her piano recital. Daniel asked about the weather near my neighborhood. Rachel mostly stared at her phone between bites. I remember thinking that if we could just get through the evening quietly, maybe things would feel normal again. Maybe Rachel and I could learn how to exist in the same room without that invisible wall between us. But sometimes a moment arrives when a long pattern finally shows itself all at once. It happens quickly. A comment here. A look there. Rachel glanced at my plate when the waiter set it down and said, "You ordered that?" Her voice carried just enough surprise to make it sound like a criticism. I laughed lightly and said Emma liked the same dish. Rachel didn't laugh. She leaned forward, rested her elbows on the table, and studied me for a second like she was deciding something. Then she pushed my plate toward the edge. Not hard. Just enough for gravity to finish the job. The pasta slid off the table and landed on the floor with that soft but unmistakable sound. And that's when she said it. "Which? You should have never come." The strange thing is, I didn't feel angry. Not right away. I felt something colder than anger, something quieter. I looked across the table at my son. Daniel didn't look back. He was staring at the salt shaker as if it had suddenly become the most interesting object in the room. In that moment, the entire restaurant seemed very still. The music playing through the speakers sounded distant, like it was coming from another building. Rachel sat back again, perfectly calm. As if she had simply corrected a mistake. What she didn't realize, what none of them realized, was that sometimes the loudest moment in a family's story isn't the insult. It's the silence that follows it. For a few seconds no one at our table said anything. The waiter who had been walking past us slowed down and looked at the floor, then quickly looked away like he was not sure whether he should step in. I could hear the quiet clinking of silverware from the tables around us, but our booth felt strangely separate from the rest of the room, like we were sitting behind invisible glass. I kept my hands folded in my lap and watched the cream sauce slowly spread across the dark wood floor beneath the table. It is funny what the mind notices in moments like that. Not the insult. Not even the embarrassment. I noticed the lemon slice floating in my water glass and the small crack in the corner of the table where the varnish had worn thin. Rachel did not look upset. She looked satisfied, the way someone looks after finally saying something they have been holding back for a long time. Daniel was still staring downward, his shoulders slightly hunched, as if he hoped the moment would disappear if he stayed quiet long enough. I realized then that the dinner invitation had never really been about Emma's recital. That had only been the polite reason. The truth had been building for months, maybe longer, and tonight it had simply reached the surface. I had sensed it before, of course. Mothers usually do. The distance. The way phone calls became shorter. The way holidays slowly changed shape until you were no longer sure whether you were included or simply tolerated. A year earlier things had already begun to feel different. Rachel had started organizing every family gathering herself. Birthdays, holidays, even small Sunday lunches. Daniel used to call me directly for those things. After Rachel came along, the invitations always came through her. Sometimes they arrived late. Sometimes they did not arrive at all. When Emma turned 10, the party was held at their house. I found out about it from a photograph online 2 days later. Balloons in the background. Emma smiling with cake frosting on her cheek. I remember sitting at my kitchen table with my reading glasses halfway down my nose, staring at that picture longer than I should have. When I asked Daniel about it later, he sounded surprised that I had not known. Rachel had told him she sent me a message. Perhaps she did. Perhaps she did not. Families are strange like that. Things disappear quietly. Explanations become blurry. And everyone convinces themselves that it is easier not to ask too many questions. Even so, I still believed that night at the restaurant was simply a chance to start over. I had chosen my blouse carefully before leaving the house, a soft blue one Emma once said made my eyes look bright. I even arrived 10 minutes early because I did not want anyone waiting for me. I remember standing outside the restaurant doors watching cars pass along the street while the evening air cooled the sidewalk. It had felt like the beginning of a normal evening. That is the strange thing about moments that change a family forever. They begin in completely ordinary ways. A phone call. A dinner reservation. A chair pulled out at a table. I slowly lifted my eyes from the floor and looked across at Rachel. She met my gaze without blinking. For the first time that evening I noticed something in her expression that had always been there but never quite so clear. It was not anger. It was certainty. She believed she had already won something. Perhaps she thought tonight would finally push me far enough away that I would stop showing up at family dinners. Perhaps she thought silence meant surrender. Daniel shifted slightly in his seat but still did not speak. Emma was quietly sipping her lemonade, unaware that the air between the adults at the table had grown heavier than anything a child should have to understand. I reached for my napkin again and gently wiped a drop of water from the table beside my glass. Then I looked at my son. He still had not raised his eyes. In that quiet moment, something inside me settled into place with a calm that surprised even me. Because Rachel had made one mistake. She believed this dinner was the end of something. She did not realize it was only the beginning. I did not raise my voice. I did not push my chair back or demand an apology. Instead, I reached for my glass of water and took a slow sip while the quiet around our table stretched just a little longer. The waiter finally stepped forward and crouched down beside the fallen plate, gathering the scattered pasta with a small cloth and a practiced smile that tried very hard to pretend nothing unusual had happened. Restaurants survive on that skill. They learn to smooth over moments that should probably never have happened in the first place. Rachel watched him work for a moment and then leaned back against the booth again as if the situation had already ended in her favor. She brushed a strand of dark hair away from her face and looked across the table at me with the same calm certainty she had shown earlier. Daniel shifted beside her but still did not speak. I noticed the way his hands were folded tightly together on the table, the way his thumb rubbed slowly against the side of his wedding ring. I had seen that gesture before when he was younger, back when he was nervous about telling me something he thought might disappoint me. The difference now was that he was not nervous about disappointing me. He was nervous about upsetting Rachel. That realization sat quietly in my chest like a small weight. Emma looked between the three of us with wide eyes. She was trying to understand why the adults suddenly felt so different from a few minutes earlier. Children can sense tension even when they do not fully understand it. I gave her a gentle smile to let her know she had done nothing wrong. Then I turned my attention back to Rachel. The strange thing was that I was not surprised by what she had said. The words themselves had been harsh, yes, but the feeling behind them had been present for a long time. It had simply been hidden behind polite smiles and carefully chosen sentences. When Rachel first came into our family, she had seemed perfectly pleasant. She was organized, confident, the type of woman who always had a plan for everything. Daniel admired that about her. He had always been the kind of man who preferred peace over confrontation, and Rachel's certainty gave his life a kind of structure he found comforting. At the beginning I believed that structure would include me as well. I remember the first Thanksgiving she hosted after their wedding. The table had been beautifully arranged with folded napkins and small candles shaped like autumn leaves. Rachel had thanked everyone for coming and told me how much she appreciated the pie I brought. But later that evening, when most of the dishes had already been cleared away, she stood beside me in the kitchen while Daniel carried plates to the sink. Her voice was low enough that only I could hear it. She said, "Daniel worries about you a lot, Margaret. You should try not to depend on him so much." I had laughed softly at the time because the idea seemed almost absurd. I had my own home. My own routine. My own life that had existed long before Rachel ever met my son. But her words stayed with me longer than I expected. Not because they were cruel, but because they revealed something important about the way she saw the world. Rachel believed families needed a clear center. And in her mind that center was not Daniel. It was her. Over the following months small changes began appearing around the edges of our relationship. Daniel called less often. Holiday plans became shorter conversations. When I suggested visiting Emma for a weekend, Rachel always seemed to have another schedule already arranged. None of these things were dramatic on their own. They were small adjustments, the kind people easily overlook if they want to believe everything is still normal. Sitting there in that restaurant booth, watching the waiter carry away the empty plate, I realized something else. Rachel had not suddenly decided to insult me tonight. She had been moving toward this moment for a long time. She had been testing the distance between us, seeing how far she could push the boundaries without anyone objecting. And tonight she had pushed them in front of witnesses. What she did not yet understand was that moments like this do not only reveal a person's anger. They reveal what that person truly believes about the people around them. Rachel believed I was already outside the circle of this family. She believed Daniel would remain silent. She believed that after tonight I would quietly step back and allow her version of our family to exist without interference. I looked once more at my son. His eyes were still lowered. The music playing softly through the restaurant speakers drifted above our table like a distant memory. And in that quiet space between one breath and the next, I understood something very clearly. Rachel had been studying me for months, measuring my patience, my silence, my willingness to stay polite even when things felt wrong. But she had misunderstood one very important thing about me. Silence does not always mean weakness. Sometimes it simply means someone is waiting for the right moment to speak. The waiter returned a few minutes later with a fresh plate and a careful smile that felt rehearsed. He placed it in front of me as if nothing unusual had happened, then quietly stepped away. The new dish looked exactly like the one before it. The same ribbon of pasta. The same pale cream sauce. The same sprinkle of parsley on top. For a moment I simply looked at it without touching my fork. The restaurant had slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Conversations resumed. Glasses clinked softly. Someone at a nearby table laughed about something I could not hear. But our booth still felt different. The air around us had not fully relaxed. Rachel noticed the replacement plate and gave a small amused breath through her nose, almost like a quiet laugh meant only for herself. She leaned one elbow on the table and glanced at Daniel. "See," she said lightly. "Everything is fine." Daniel nodded once without looking at anyone in particular. Emma was tracing a circle on the condensation of her lemonade glass with her fingertip. Children have a way of withdrawing into small quiet activities when the adults around them begin acting strange. I picked up my fork slowly and turned the pasta once, not because I intended to eat it, but because the motion gave my hands something steady to do. The metal made a soft sound against the ceramic plate. Rachel watched the movement for a moment and then spoke again, her tone casual but sharp underneath. "You always show up at the worst moments," she said. "Daniel tries to keep things simple, but you make it complicated." I lifted my eyes and met her gaze calmly. There was no shouting in her voice. No dramatic scene. Just a quiet certainty that her words were justified. That was the part many people misunderstand about moments like this. They imagine anger as loud. In reality, it is often delivered very calmly. I thought about the first time Rachel ever visited my house after she and Daniel started dating. She had walked through the front door carrying a bouquet of grocery store flowers and complimented the old oak shelves in my living room. We drank coffee at the kitchen table while Daniel talked about work. Rachel had listened politely, nodding at the right moments, studying the framed photographs on the wall behind me. One of those pictures showed Daniel at 12 years old standing beside the small fishing boat his father built in our garage. Rachel stared at that photo longer than the others. Finally she said, "You must have done a lot for him." I told her that was what parents were supposed to do. She smiled and replied, "Some parents forget to let go." At the time I thought she meant it as a general observation, the kind people make during conversations when they are trying to sound thoughtful. Looking back now, I realized she was already explaining the way she saw our relationship. In Rachel's world, families were organized like circles with a clear center. And she had decided long ago who belonged inside that center and who stood outside it. I rested my fork on the edge of the plate and folded my hands again. Rachel seemed to be waiting for a reaction, some sign that her words had landed the way she expected. When none came, she tilted her head slightly. "Do you have anything to say?" she asked. Her tone carried a hint of impatience, as though silence itself was becoming inconvenient. I glanced briefly at Daniel. My son finally looked up, but only for a moment before his eyes drifted back toward the table. That small movement told me everything I needed to know. Rachel believed she had already settled the matter tonight. She believed the embarrassment, the dropped plate, the quiet accusation had pushed me far enough away that I would stop appearing at dinners like this one. But there are moments in life when a person realizes something with absolute clarity. Sitting there beneath the soft restaurant lights, I understood that Rachel had spent months measuring my patience, mistaking it for weakness. What she did not understand was that patience can also be preparation. I reached for my water glass again and took another slow sip before setting it down carefully beside my napkin. Then I looked directly at Rachel and spoke for the first time since the plate had fallen. My voice was calm, almost gentle. "You are right about one thing," I said quietly. "This evening will make things much simpler." Rachel blinked once, clearly expecting something else. She had been waiting for an argument. Instead she received certainty. And that was the moment when the balance at the table began to shift, even though none of them realized it yet. The words hung in the air for a moment after I said them. Rachel leaned back slightly, her expression shifting from quiet confidence to something more curious, like someone trying to understand a sentence that did not sound the way she expected. Daniel looked up again, this time a little longer, as if he was searching my face for some hint of what I meant. But I did not explain anything. Instead, I simply rested my hands on the table and allowed the silence to settle once more. Emma broke the quiet first, her voice small but hopeful. She looked at me and said, "Grandma, did you like my recital tonight?" I turned toward her and smiled warmly. "I loved it," I said gently. "You played beautifully." Her shoulders relaxed at once, and she brightened the way children do when they know someone truly saw them. For a moment the tension at the table softened. Emma began explaining how nervous she had been before walking onto the stage and how the piano bench felt colder than she expected under the bright auditorium lights. I listened carefully, nodding as she spoke, letting her finish every thought without interruption. Rachel watched the exchange with a faint crease forming between her eyebrows. Perhaps she expected me to leave immediately after what had happened. Perhaps she thought embarrassment would drive me away from the table. But the truth was much simpler. I had no reason to rush. I reached for my fork again and calmly tasted a small bite of the pasta that had replaced the one on the floor. It was warm and rich, the sauce smooth and heavy with cream. I set the fork down after a single bite. Rachel's patience seemed to thin slightly as the minutes passed without the reaction she had expected. Finally she crossed her arms and spoke again. "You are very quiet tonight," she said. Her tone carried a faint challenge, as though silence itself had become an inconvenience she wanted to correct. I glanced at her and offered a mild smile. "Sometimes quiet evenings are the most revealing," I replied calmly. Daniel shifted again in his seat. He cleared his throat softly, a small sound that felt almost out of place in the stillness around us. "Mom," he said carefully, "Rachel did not mean," his voice trailed off before the sentence finished. Rachel turned her head toward him with a look that stopped the rest of the explanation before it could form. Daniel lowered his eyes again. I watched that brief exchange with the calm attention of someone observing a familiar pattern finally revealing itself clearly. It was not the first time Daniel had started to speak and then stopped halfway through. Over the years that pause had appeared more often. The strange thing about moments like this is that they do not always feel dramatic while they are happening. They feel quiet. Almost ordinary. Yet beneath the surface something important is rearranging itself. Rachel leaned forward slightly and placed her palms flat on the table. "Let us not pretend nothing happened," she said evenly. "You know exactly why I said what I said." I studied her expression for a moment. She truly believed she was correcting a problem, like someone adjusting a picture frame that had been hanging crooked for too long. In her mind, the dinner was not an insult. It was a necessary conversation finally spoken aloud. I nodded once, slowly. "Yes," I said. "I believe I do understand." Rachel waited for more, but I did not add anything else. The waiter returned again to refill our water glasses, moving carefully around the table as if he sensed the delicate balance of the moment. When he left, Rachel sighed quietly and leaned back once more. "Good," she said. "Then we are finally being honest." Daniel looked up again, confusion and discomfort mixing in his expression. Emma continued sipping her lemonade, unaware that the adults around her were standing at the edge of a conversation that would quietly reshape the future of this family. I folded my napkin neatly beside my plate and glanced toward the restaurant windows where the evening traffic passed in slow streams of red brake lights. Then I turned back to Rachel and met her eyes again. "Honesty is a useful thing," I said gently. "Especially when it arrives at the right moment." Rachel held my gaze, waiting. She believed the evening had reached its conclusion. But what she did not understand was that this dinner had already given me something far more valuable than an apology. The restaurant lights had dimmed slightly as the evening moved forward, and the low music drifting through the speakers sounded slower now, almost thoughtful. I watched the reflections of the overhead lamps in my water glass and allowed the quiet to stretch a little longer. Rachel seemed restless in that quiet. She tapped her fingers lightly on the edge of the table, a small rhythmic motion that betrayed the impatience beneath her calm expression. She believed the conversation had reached a point where I should either defend myself or retreat. But neither of those choices interested me anymore. Daniel shifted again beside her and finally looked directly at me. His eyes carried the uncertain expression of someone who senses that the situation has grown larger than he expected. "Mom," he said carefully, "maybe we should just finish dinner and talk about this another time." I studied his face for a moment, noticing how tired he looked. Not angry. Not even truly upset. Just tired. Rachel turned toward him with a quick glance that carried quiet disapproval. She did not say anything, but the message in her eyes was clear enough. Daniel's shoulders lowered slightly, and he fell silent again. I realized then that Rachel had become very skilled at controlling the tone of a room without raising her voice. Emma had finished her lemonade and was now swinging her feet gently under the table, the heels of her small shoes tapping the booth seat in a slow rhythm. She looked at me again and smiled, completely unaware that the adults around her were standing in the middle of a turning point. I smiled back at her and said softly, "You must be proud of that recital tonight." She nodded enthusiastically and began describing the final piece she played, explaining how her piano teacher told her to keep her hands steady even when she felt nervous. As she spoke, I noticed something simple and reassuring in her voice. Children focus on what is directly in front of them. They do not carry the weight of old arguments or quiet resentments. For Emma, the evening was still about music and family and a restaurant dinner after a performance. I listened carefully until she finished her story, then I reached across the table and gently squeezed her hand. "You did wonderfully," I said. Rachel watched the exchange with an expression that was harder to read now. Perhaps she had expected the tension at the table to push Emma away from me. Instead, the moment had simply become calmer. That calm seemed to unsettle her more than any argument would have. She leaned forward again, folding her hands together as though preparing to bring the conversation back to its original point. "Margaret," she said, speaking my name slowly, "this situation cannot keep repeating itself." I raised my eyes and met her gaze again. "Which situation is that?" I asked evenly. Rachel's eyebrows lifted slightly at the question. "You appearing whenever Daniel feels responsible for inviting you," she replied. "You know how complicated things become when expectations are not clear." Her words were polished and deliberate, like someone delivering a carefully prepared explanation. I noticed the way Daniel looked down again as she spoke, his fingers returning to that small nervous movement against his ring. It occurred to me then that Rachel believed she was establishing a boundary tonight. In her mind, she was correcting a family arrangement that had been out of balance for too long. But there was something she had overlooked. I rested my hands calmly on the table and glanced briefly toward the restaurant entrance where another group of diners had just walked inside, shaking the cool evening air from their coats. Then I looked back at Rachel. "You are right about expectations," I said quietly. "They should always be clear." Rachel waited, confident that the next sentence would finally acknowledge her authority over the situation. Instead, I continued in the same calm tone. "That is exactly why tonight is useful." Daniel looked up again at that word. Useful. Rachel blinked once, the faintest crack appearing in her steady confidence. She had expected embarrassment or anger. She had expected defense or retreat. What she had not expected was calm agreement. I picked up my water glass and took one final sip before setting it down again with careful precision. The conversation around us continued softly, forks and glasses moving through the quiet rhythm of an ordinary evening. Yet at our table the balance had shifted again in a way Rachel still had not recognized. Because the truth was simple. Everything she had said tonight had confirmed something I had been quietly preparing for long before this dinner ever began. The words settled over the table like a quiet fog. Rachel did not respond immediately, and that alone told me something had shifted. She had expected resistance. She had expected an argument she could win. Instead, she was facing something less familiar. Calm. I rested my hands lightly on the table and looked toward the restaurant window again, where the reflection of our table floated faintly in the glass. For a moment I saw the four of us the way someone from outside might see us. A family sitting at dinner. A child. Two parents. And a grandmother. Nothing unusual at first glance. Yet inside that simple picture something important had already changed. Rachel straightened in her seat and folded her arms slowly. Useful, she repeated, her voice still controlled but carrying a thin edge of suspicion. I nodded once. Yes, I said quietly. Sometimes clarity arrives in unexpected places. Daniel looked from Rachel to me as if he was trying to follow a conversation that had suddenly moved beyond him. He opened his mouth as though to say something, then closed it again. Emma was now examining the small dessert menu card that had been placed near the edge of the table earlier. She traced the printed words with her finger, sounding them out softly under her breath. I watched her for a moment and felt a brief warmth in my chest. Children rarely notice the invisible negotiations that adults carry around them. That innocence was something I hoped she could keep for as long as possible. Rachel leaned forward again, this time resting both elbows on the table. Margaret, she said slowly, I think you are misunderstanding something. Tonight was not meant to be complicated. It was meant to be clear. I met her gaze without hesitation. Yes, I replied gently. It was. Her eyebrows lifted slightly at the agreement. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice careful. Mom, what exactly are you saying? The question lingered between us for a moment. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioner overhead and the quiet clatter of dishes from the kitchen in the distance. It struck me how ordinary the room still felt despite the quiet storm at our table. I folded my napkin once more, smoothing its edges with slow, deliberate movements. Then I looked at Daniel. I am saying that tonight helped me see something very clearly, I answered. Rachel gave a small, impatient breath. And what exactly is that? She asked. I turned my attention back to her. That everyone at this table finally spoke honestly, I said. Rachel held my gaze, waiting for something more confrontational, something she could push back against. But calm truth has a different weight than anger. It does not invite a fight. It simply stands where it is. Daniel rubbed his hands together slowly and glanced toward the restaurant entrance as if searching for a way to step away from the conversation without standing up. I recognized that look. It was the same expression he wore as a teenager when he hoped a difficult conversation might somehow solve itself if he waited long enough. Rachel noticed his hesitation as well. Her shoulders stiffened slightly, and she spoke again with quiet firmness. Then let us continue being honest, she said. Daniel and I have our own family now. Our own routine. And sometimes your presence makes that routine harder. The words were not shouted. They were delivered with the calm certainty of someone announcing a simple fact. Emma glanced up briefly at the sound of her parents' voices, then returned to studying the dessert menu. I listened to Rachel's sentence without interruption. When she finished, I nodded slowly as though considering the idea from every angle. I see, I said softly. Rachel seemed relieved for a brief second, as though she believed the conversation had finally reached the conclusion she expected. But there was one detail she had not noticed yet. I had not argued. I had not defended my place at the table. Instead, I had simply listened. Because sometimes the most valuable thing a person can receive is not an apology or even respect. Sometimes it is certainty. And tonight Rachel had given me exactly that. I reached for my purse beside the booth and rested my hand lightly on it, feeling the familiar leather beneath my fingers. Daniel noticed the movement and looked at me again with growing confusion. Rachel remained perfectly still, watching me carefully now. She sensed something changing but could not yet name it. The truth was simple. Long before this dinner invitation ever arrived, I had already begun preparing for a different kind of evening. Tonight had simply confirmed that the time for quiet patience was over. I kept my hand resting on my purse for a moment, feeling the quiet weight of the leather beneath my fingers while the conversation at the table hovered in a strange stillness. Rachel was watching me now with careful attention, her eyes narrowing slightly as if she sensed that something was about to change but could not yet see exactly what it was. Daniel looked from me to Rachel again, the confusion in his expression deepening with every passing second. Emma had finally found a picture of a chocolate cake on the dessert menu and was smiling at it as though it were the most interesting thing in the world. The innocence of that small moment made the tension between the adults feel even more noticeable. I slowly opened my purse and reached inside, moving with the same calm patience I had carried through the entire evening. Rachel followed the motion immediately. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Emma continued tracing the picture of the cake with her finger. I pulled out a simple cream-colored envelope and placed it gently on the table beside my water glass. For a second no one spoke. The envelope rested there quietly, completely ordinary in appearance, yet it seemed to draw all of their attention at once. Daniel frowned slightly. "Mom," he said carefully, "what is that?" I looked at him for a moment before answering. "Something I have been meaning to give you," I said softly. Rachel's eyes moved from my face to the envelope again. She did not reach for it yet. Her instincts were telling her that whatever was inside might not match the ending she had imagined for this evening. Daniel hesitated, then slowly reached across the table and picked it up. The paper made a soft sound as his fingers turned it over. "Should I open it?" he asked. I nodded once. "Yes." The restaurant noise around us continued as usual. Someone at a nearby table laughed. A waiter passed behind Daniel carrying a tray of drinks. Yet at our table everything seemed to narrow into that single moment. Daniel carefully opened the envelope and slid the folded papers inside onto the table. He glanced down at the first page, and I watched the exact moment his expression changed. Confusion came first. Then surprise. Rachel leaned closer, trying to read the document from where she sat. "What is it?" she asked. Daniel did not answer immediately. He scanned the page again, slower this time, as if he needed to make sure the words were really there. Finally he looked up at me. "Mom, this says you sold the house." I nodded calmly. Rachel blinked, clearly not expecting that answer. "Sold the house," she repeated. Daniel continued reading the document quietly. His eyes moved from one line to the next while the reality slowly settled in. "The closing date was last week," he said slowly. Rachel straightened in her seat, her confidence shifting into something far less certain. "You sold your house?" she asked again, her voice slightly sharper now. I folded my hands gently together on the table. "Yes," I said. Daniel looked at the next page and frowned again. "But, where are you going to live?" he asked. I met his gaze calmly. "I already moved," I replied. Rachel's eyebrows lifted. "Moved where?" she asked quickly. I allowed a small, peaceful smile to appear on my face. "A quiet coastal town in Oregon," I said. "About 15 minutes from the ocean. There is a small house there with a porch that faces the water. It is not large, but it is exactly the kind of place I wanted." Daniel looked stunned. "You already moved?" he asked. I nodded again. "The movers finished yesterday morning." Rachel stared at the papers as though they might explain something she had missed. But the truth was already clear. For years I had lived 10 minutes away from Daniel's family, always close enough to help, always close enough to be available whenever they needed something. Tonight Rachel had explained that my presence made their routine harder. The words had been very clear. I leaned back slightly in the booth and looked at both of them with the same calm expression I had carried all evening. "So you see," I said gently, "tonight's conversation arrived at exactly the right moment." Daniel continued staring at the papers in his hands as if the meaning might change if he looked long enough. The quiet hum of the restaurant filled the silence while the truth slowly settled around our table. Rachel finally leaned forward and took the documents from him, scanning the first page quickly. Her confidence from earlier in the evening had faded into a careful tension. She turned the page, reading faster now, searching for something that might make the situation feel different from what it was. "You sold the house without telling us," she said, her voice tighter than before. I nodded calmly. "Yes," I replied. Daniel rubbed his forehead slowly as if he was trying to piece together a timeline that suddenly no longer made sense. "Mom, that house has been your home for 30 years, he said quietly. "You cannot just leave like that." I looked at him gently, noticing the mixture of worry and surprise in his face. "Actually," I said softly, "I already did." Rachel lowered the papers onto the table and looked at me with a new kind of focus. "And you moved to Oregon," she said. "Without even discussing it with your family." I met her gaze without hesitation. "You explained very clearly tonight that Daniel and Emma are your family routine," I said calmly. I did not want to complicate that routine any longer. Daniel shifted in his seat again. "Mom, that is not what Rachel meant," he said quickly, though his voice carried more uncertainty than conviction. Rachel glanced toward him but did not interrupt. I studied my son for a moment, remembering the young boy who once ran across the backyard holding a toy airplane above his head, convinced he would someday become a pilot. Life changes people slowly, almost quietly. Responsibilities arrive. Priorities shift. And sometimes families rearrange themselves in ways no one expected years earlier. I reached for my water glass and took a small sip before continuing. "The house by the ocean is peaceful," I said. "There is a small garden behind it and a wooden porch that faces the water. In the mornings you can hear the waves from the kitchen window." Emma looked up at that description immediately. "Grandma, you can hear the ocean?" she asked with wide eyes. I smiled warmly at her. "Yes, sweetheart. It sounds like a long gentle whisper." Emma's face lit up with curiosity, but Rachel spoke again before she could ask more questions. "That is a long way from here," Rachel said carefully. "Almost 2,000 miles. I nodded. "Yes." Daniel looked down at the documents again and shook his head slowly. "Why did you not tell me before?" he asked quietly. The question carried more emotion than anything he had said all evening. I rested my hands on the table and answered honestly. "Because I wanted to see if there was still space for me here," I said gently. The words hung between us. Rachel did not respond immediately. Daniel's eyes lifted slowly to meet mine. "And now?" he asked. I glanced around the restaurant once more, noticing the warm lights, the quiet conversations at nearby tables, the ordinary rhythm of a place where strangers gathered to share meals. Then I looked back at my family. "Now I know," I said calmly. Rachel looked down at the papers again, her expression thoughtful in a way it had not been earlier. Daniel leaned back in his seat, the weight of the evening finally settling on his shoulders. Emma swung her feet again under the table and said softly, "Grandma, can I visit your ocean house someday?" I reached across the table and squeezed her small hand with gentle affection. "Of course you can," I said. Then I picked up my purse, preparing to stand. The dinner invitation that had once seemed so important now felt like the closing page of a chapter that had quietly ended.